In this lesson, we'll continue our discussion of the urinary system by taking a look at the anatomy of the nephron. We can think of the nephron as the functional unit of the kidney. This is the structure that is going to form the urine. Now, there's different types of nephrons based on their locations, and they have a couple structural differences. One type of nephron that you're going to see is known as a cortical nephron. This is located predominantly in the renal cortex. If we were to look here, just to kind of review, here's the fibrous capsule out over here. This region is the cortex, and then this would be the medulla, where this triangular structure is the renal pyramid. The cortical nephron, you can, if you notice, starts kind of in the upper part of the cortex, and then it extends down, and it may project a little bit into the medulla, but typically has a shorter tubes like this. Where the second nephron is known as the juxtamedullary nephron. Juxta means next to, medulla, right? So it's kind of next to medulla, are located in the lower parts of the cortex, and then it extends down. So notice here the main part of the nephron is in the lower part of the cortex, and then its tubes are much longer, and it projects way down into the renal pyramid. Okay, so that's the cortical nephron and the juxtamedullary nephron. So let's take a look at the anatomy of the nephron. This is kind of an overview slide. We're going to break the nephron down into two parts, the renal corpuscle and then the renal tubule. Each one of these has multiple parts. For instance, the renal corpuscle has two parts. Something known as the glomerular capsule is what we used to call Bowman's capsule. Many people still do, so I think you should know both names, glomerular capsule as well as Bowman's capsule. And then the glomerulus. Okay, so both of these structures are going to be part of the renal corpuscle. Then we'll take a look at the renal tubule, and that consists of three parts. The proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, is what we used to call the loop of Henle, and we hear that still from time to time. And then the third part is going to be the distal convoluted tubule. So let's begin with the renal corpuscle first and look at the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus. So we're looking at the glomerular capsule. Like I said, it used to be known as the Bowman's capsule, but there are a number of people that still call it the Bowman's capsule. It has three parts to it that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the capsular epithelium, the visceral epithelium, and the space in between known as the capsular space. So before we go through the notes, let's take a look here. What we have here is a nephron up top over here, and this part here is actually going to be our renal corpuscle. It's going to be this Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule. That's this kind of purple structure here. And then the blood vessels in the middle are going to be the glomerulus. So this purple structure here, if you follow my cursor, is this here, all of this. This is known as the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. Now, the cells, you can see they're simple squamous epithelium, right? One layer of flat cells. All these cells that are lining this outside wall are known as the capsular epithelium, right? In some of your readings, you may see the word parietal epithelium. That's another term that we could use. Parietal means wall, so it's the epithelium up against the wall. Okay, so this would be the capsular epithelium, all of these cells that are lining the glomerular capsule. Now, the glomerulus is the blood vessels that are inside here, but they're covered by a cell known as a podocyte. This is what we're going to refer to as the visceral epithelium. This is going to be the inner lining of the glomerular capsule. So it's these cells that are on the blood vessels, right? They're going to be the inner lining of this capsule right here. So we have the visceral epithelium, that's the podocytes on the glomerular capillaries. Then we have the simple squamous epithelium. They form the capsular epithelium. Now notice these two structures, the capsular epithelium and the podocytes, the visceral epithelium, do not touch one another. There's a space here. This space is known as the capsular space. Again, that's going to become important when we make urine. Fluid is going to fill up in that space and then go into the tubes we're going to describe in a couple moments. You'll notice that the podocytes actually have little slits there. The red that you can see in there is actually the capillary in between these little pedicels that are coming down. These are called filtration slits, and it helps to make the filtrate when we talk about urine formation. All right, so what do we need to know so far? The glomerular capsule, or the Bowman's capsule, is this structure here. It has two parts that we need to know right now. The cells that line the wall of the capsule are known as the capsular epithelium, right? All these cells, and they are simple squamous cells. Then the cells that are on the blood vessels, known the glomerulus, right? It's kind of like this cell. To me, it looks like it's just kind of wrapping around the blood vessel. This cell here is known as a podocyte. Right? And it has little feet-like extensions called pedicels, and then little filtration slits. You'll talk about that more in lecture. For me, I just want you to know these are called podocytes. Then the capsular epithelium and the visceral epithelium have a space in between. You're just going to call this space the capsular space. Let's go back to the notes. So we're talking about the renal corpuscle. The first part of the renal corpuscle is the glomerular capsule, or the Bowman's capsule, and it consists of the capsular epithelium, which is made up of simple squamous epithelium. Like I said, you may want to add to the notes that sometimes we call it the parietal epithelium. Parietal means wall, so it would be the epithelium up against the wall. And so this is the epithelium that lines the wall of the capsule. Then the second part I'd like you to know is the visceral epithelium. Those are the podocytes, and they cover the glomerular capillaries, right? They're going to cover the blood vessels. And then the space in between, you're simply going to call the capsular space. Okay. The second part of the renal corpuscle is the glomerulus. This consists of about 50 intertwining capillaries that are fenestrated. Right? If you remember from the anatomy part of blood vessels, that capillaries sometimes have little pores in them known as fenestra, and these are examples of that, where they're going to be kind of leaky capillaries. Fluid is going to easily move out of the capillary. Now, here's a simple picture just showing you no podocytes or anything like that. Kind of the podocytes are removed, and you can see all these capillaries. That would be the glomerulus, right? And then in real life, the glomerulus would be covered by the podocytes, right? So the blood vessels under these podocytes are these. We also had done in a previous lesson that the glomerulus is fed by an arteriole here known as the afferent arteriole that brings the blood into the glomerulus, and then the blood leaves via the efferent. I also had mentioned in previous lessons that you want to pay attention that the afferent arteriole is always going to be a wider diameter than the efferent arteriole, right? So this is going to be wider than this. What that does is it's going to allow more blood to come in faster than it's leaving, and that's going to increase the pressure inside the glomerular capillaries. and that's going to force fluid out of those pores, out of those fenestra that we were talking about. And now the fluid will go into here, and this is going to be like the first phase of making urine, right? We would actually call this fluid in here the filtrate, right? We'll talk about that in a subsequent lesson. Okay, so this is what the glomerulus looks like, and basically, again, it's about 50 intertwining capillaries, and then the blood vessel that's bringing the blood into the glomerulus are known as the afferent arteriole. If you just want to jot down one more time, these are going to be the wider ones. That'll help you to find it in the lab. And then the blood is going to leave the glomerulus through or via the efferent arteriole. And if you just want to put down, that's going to have a smaller diameter, smaller diameter. Okay, so I'm going to go back a minute. So what we just did was the renal corpuscle consists of the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus, right? That's just what we did. Now we want to take a look at the rest of the nephron. That's going to be the renal tubule. That's going to consist of three parts. I always call it the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule, then the nephron loop, or what used to be called the loop of Henle, and then the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule. All right, so let's do this now. So let's scroll down a little bit. Okay, so the renal tubule, as I mentioned, has three main sections I'm going to show you. The first one is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal means it's kind of at the beginning. So this is the beginning part of the tube. It's closest to the Bowman's capsule or to the glomerular capsule. Watch this. Here's a picture of a cortical nephron and a juxtamedullary nephron over here. We could look at either one. Let's look at the juxtamedullary one because it's just a little bit easier to see. But here's the Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule. This tube that leaves right here and comes up and it turns out to be a little bit twisted is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal means that it's closest to the glomerular capsule, and convoluted means twisted. Okay, so it's not like a straight tube, it's actually got some twisting to it. Okay, so that's our PCT. Then we have the nephron loop. As I mentioned, this used to be called the loop of Henle. A lot of people still call it that, so I do want you to know both names. And that's going to have two parts. So check this out. So from the proximal convoluted tubule, let's start here. Here's your proximal convoluted tubule. The fluid in there is going to go through that tubule, and then watch this. It's going to start to go down like this, and then up. So this whole thing, this down and then up, is the nephron loop. The part that goes down is the descending limb. The part that goes up is the ascending limb. Okay, so that's going to be the nephron loop, has a descending limb and then an ascending limb. That then is going to lead to the the DCT, the distal convoluted tubule. All right, so let's follow from the ascending limb again. Here's your ascending limb. Let me follow my cursor. Then watch this. The distal convoluted tubule, notice something, just kind of keep this in the back of your mind, is always going to go to where the afferent and efferent arterioles are. They're always going to pass over there. I'll show you why in a minute. And then it's going to become a twisted tube. You know, it's going to be kind of twisted, and then it's going to end over here when it drains, at this point, urine into this collecting duct over here. So this tube from about here, all this, it goes over to the afferent arteriole, and then over to here is your DCT, distal convoluted tubule. Distal means that it's furthest away from the Bowman's capsule, and then again, convoluted means that it's twisted. Okay, so that's your distal convoluted tubule. So you'll notice that this distal convoluted tubule, as I mentioned before, goes back towards the afferent arteriole. So I'm going to bring this picture back here for a moment. So see if you can recognize this. Here's your afferent arteriole bringing blood into the glomerulus. Here's your efferent arteriole coming out. Here's that DCT, the distal convoluted tubule, right here, and they just cut it so that we could look into it. There's a couple structures that are associated with the distal convoluted tubule. I'll go back to the notes in a minute. called the juxtaglomerular complex. And this juxtaglomerular complex helps to regulate, believe it or not, blood pressure. It helps to regulate the formation of that filtrate, the fluid that's in here. So these are important regulatory cells. So the first ones I want you to notice are going to be these cells right here in the distal convoluted tubule. Normally, the cells in the distal convoluted tubule are cuboidal cells like this, and they're fairly good size. What happens is here they get packed closer together, and they sometimes even get a little bit taller. They become more columnar. But here you can see how they're like packed closely together. Well, these packed cells of the distal convoluted tubule is known as the macula densa. Just think that they're densely packed. These macula densa cells are regulatory cells of the juxtaglomerular complex. Like I said, they're involved with regulating blood pressure and the rate of filtration, glomerular filtration. These are things that are discussed in lecture in much more detail. The other cells I want you to notice besides the macula densa are all these cells in here. These are known as the juxtaglomerular cells. So they work with the macula densa to again regulate blood pressure, to regulate glomerular filtration. Okay, so this relationship of the distal convoluted tubule to this area here where the blood vessels are is important, and that's why again you'll always see, even on this nephron end here, the distal convoluted tubule going past these blood vessels. Let's see if we can see it up here. Here's your distal convoluted tubule. See how it goes next to the afferent arteriole before it continues on. Right, so that's an important relationship. Okay, so the distal convoluted tubule has, again, it's in close relationship with the juxtaglomerular complex. As I mentioned before, it helps to regulate BP and glomerular filtrate formation, right? The formation of filtrate. The two parts I'd like you to know are the macula densa. They're going to be in the distal convoluted tubule. You'll see the cells are densely packed. And like I said, they become a little bit more columnar, even though this picture is not really showing them as columnar cells. You definitely see them more packed. And then the juxtaglomerular cells, they're going to be alongside the macula densa, so they're going to be all around here. Okay, all these cells here. So the next part of the nephron that we want to look at is what we call the collecting duct. Once the urine is formed, let's go back a moment here. Once the urine is formed, let's say in the distal convoluted tubule, there's a main, like I always think like a sewer line, just kind of coming right down the middle of the renal pyramid. Comes right down the middle, and you'll see different nephrons tying into the collecting duct. So that you kind of picture this as a sewer line running down the middle of your street, and then each house has a line going into that main sewer line. This is called the collecting duct, and they run down the middle of the renal pyramid, and they're going to now drip the urine out of the renal papilla. If you remember from a previous lesson, the tip of the renal pyramid is known as the papilla. So the urine is now going to drip out, and this brown area would be the minor calyx. That would be the like the cup that's going to collect the urine. Right. So here we see a couple different collecting ducts bringing the urine down to drip out of the papilla. They actually call this the papillary duct, and then the minor calyx will carry it. So you can see here what this is here. This is the renal pyramid, and then this would be the papilla right over here. Okay, and so that's the collecting duct. So the distal convoluted tubule of several nephrons, right? So it's again like think of that collecting duct as going right down the middle of your street, and every house on your street has a sewer line going to the collecting duct. That's kind of what this is. All right, so distal convoluted tubule of several nephrons empty into a single collecting duct. The collecting ducts then unite to form several hundred larger papillary ducts, and that's going to have the urine drain into the minor calyces. So you may look at some histology slides of the nephron to just give you a little bit of an idea. This is showing here the renal cortex, a little bit of an overview of what you would see in the renal cortex. So let's take a look at this slide magnified, and you can see here these would be like the renal corpuscles that would have the Bowman's capsule on the outside, and then this would be the glomerulus. So you could see all these different renal corpuscles here. And you don't even have to magnify it very much. This is at very low power. 100 is considered low power. All right, and then if we go a little bit higher, now we say we focus in on one of these here at high power, we can then see. So this would be the glomerulus. This is all the blood vessels inside the renal corpuscle. Then this is the capsular space right here. And then this would be the simple squamous epithelium. That would be the capsular epithelium all on the outside. And then here you're seeing some renal tubules, some parts of the nephron on cross section. We're catching a little bit of that. You can see that nicely there. Then this is actually showing now the renal medulla a little bit further down, where we see a bunch of the different collecting ducts. That's like that main sewer line. There's some collecting ducts right here. Here's some parts of the nephron, the ascending and the descending loop limbs of the loop of Henle or the nephron loop. Okay, and this is just a blow up. Okay, same type of thing. So that concludes this lesson on the nephron. Again, you want to focus on the nephron having two main parts: the renal corpuscle, which consists of the Bowman's capsule, or uh, the capsule, Bowman's capsule, and then it would consist also of the glomerulus, and then finally the tubes are going to be the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle or the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule.